If you've ever wondered exactly when the cold finally locks in where you live, today's the video for that. We're diving into the first freeze forecast for 2026, starting with the average date your area typically sees that very first freeze, then layering our fall and winter temperature outlook right on top of it to figure out whether you're tracking earlier or later than normal this year. This ties directly into the winter forecast for 2026 to 2027 we just put out. So if you haven't seen that one yet, it's worth checking out alongside this one. Let's get into the freeze timeline, which I build the same way every year, layer by layer, so you can see exactly how the season progresses, region by region across the whole country. By the way, if you'd like specific weather forecasts for your region or city, please leave them in the comments. I'll answer them individually as time allows. Also, if you like the video and subscribe to my channel, you'd be very grateful. Now, let's move on. We're basically standing right at the doorstep of late August already, and that's genuinely the first window where anyone starts seeing a freeze. Honestly, I'd be surprised if many of you watching are actually inside this zone right now, since we're talking almost exclusively about high mountaintop terrain. If you do live somewhere in this bracket, I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments. Moving into the next layer, early September, roughly the 1st through the 15th, and this is where things open up a bit more. There's a real chance some of you fall into this window now. We're talking the northern Sierra Nevada, sections of the Oregon Cascades, the northern and central Rockies, and, interestingly, a slice of north-central Minnesota joins this group too, all potentially seeing their first freeze in that early September stretch. Late September is where the map really starts filling in. Nearly all of Nevada, the entire Cascade Range, and the whole Rocky Mountain corridor fall into this window now. We also pick up a big chunk of the northern plains, the far upper Midwest, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and the northern tip of the Lower Peninsula, and the Northeast joins the party too, with the Adirondacks in New York, Vermont's Green Mountains, New Hampshire's White Mountains, and even Maine's Northern Mountains, all typically freezing for the first time somewhere between mid and late September. That's a genuinely large swath of the country crossing into freeze territory within just a couple of weeks, which is part of what makes this stretch of the calendar so interesting to track. By early October, we're covering close to half the country. Out west, the terrain gets tricky to map cleanly, since elevation shifts so dramatically over just a few miles. Sometimes a difference of a few thousand feet within a short drive completely changes the freeze timing, but heading east, it becomes much clearer. The desert Southwest starts picking up its first freezes here too, hitting a good portion of the Four Corners states in that October 1st through 15th window. Move into the Central Plains and Midwest, and you'll find Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, the lower half of Michigan, parts of Ohio on both sides of the state, and essentially the entire Appalachian Range joining the same time frame, along with New England, including Boston, central Connecticut, and even northwestern New Jersey. At this point, what's left is mostly lower elevation terrain, the valleys and coastal plains that hold on to warmth just a bit longer than everything surrounding them. Late October brings us the next layer. Out west, there isn't a ton of additional movement, though a bit more of the lower Four Corners region gets included. The Central Plains picks up steam, though, with the Texas Panhandle, northern Oklahoma, and southern Kansas joining in. The lower Midwest follows suit, Missouri, Illinois, and northern Arkansas among them, along with most of the southern Ohio Valley states, essentially all of Ohio and Indiana at this point, plus the entirety of Kentucky, most of Tennessee, and even the northern edges of Deep South states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. The Mid-Atlantic is mostly still waiting though. Generally, the Chesapeake Bay area and southward hasn't seen its first freeze yet by late October. That delay makes sense once you factor in the ocean, since all that summer warmth takes months to bleed out, and until the surrounding water cools sufficiently, it keeps pulling those first truly cold air masses at bay, moderating temperatures for coastal communities well after inland areas have already dipped below freezing. Early November, the 1st through the 15th, brings in the southern plains and, somewhat surprisingly, the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, and Washington included. Texas picks up more coverage, though still not entirely, along with northern Louisiana and the rest of Arkansas. Most of the Deep South joins here too, with the exception of the immediate Gulf Coast. So the bulk of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, plus the eastern halves of Virginia and North Carolina, all typically see their first freeze somewhere in this window. And then we arrive at the final layer, everything that averages a freeze after November 15th. For a lot of these areas, that means somewhere between November 15th and December 1st. Though for the coldest stretches, likely closer to the first or second week of January, the southernmost reaches, places like northern Florida or southern Texas, that first and sometimes only freeze of the year might not even arrive until after December, possibly deep into January. Some of these spots sit right on the edge. Some years they simply don't get one at all, but on average they still do, which is exactly why these southernmost freezes tend to catch people off guard when they finally show up. Beyond that is the green zone, and this category works quite a bit differently from everything else we've covered. These are areas that don't average a freeze every single year at all. Along the northern edge of this zone, closest to that lighter blue band, you might average a freeze roughly every other year, so one winter it happens, the next it doesn't. Push farther south and it stretches out even more, maybe once every 5 years, sometimes once a decade, sometimes even longer than that. It's genuinely a wide spectrum within these lighter shaded areas, and honestly, that variability is one of the more fascinating parts of this whole map for me, because it means the impact of any given freeze in these zones can be wildly different depending on how long it's been since the last one. Worth noting, this entire map is hand-drawn by me, so especially in high-contrast terrain like the Cascades, Sierra Nevada, and Rockies, there's naturally some room for minor inaccuracy given how dramatically elevation shifts over short distances. Keep that in mind as you're looking at your specific location, particularly if you live somewhere with a lot of vertical relief nearby. Now let's layer our fall and winter temperature forecast on top of this timeline, since that's really what tells us whether you're tracking toward an earlier or later first freeze than average this year. Starting with fall, we're expecting above normal temperatures across the Northwest and into part of the North-Central states, and I think that's likely to push first freeze dates later than usual there, especially given that this window lines up directly with when those mountain ranges typically see their first freeze in late August into September. Some locations may have already experienced their first freeze given where we currently sit in the calendar, so it really depends on the specific spot and elevation, but the overall lean for this region is toward delay rather than an early arrival. Moving eastward and focusing on the areas that typically see their first freeze during fall, which covers essentially everyone outside the Deep South, most of these regions lean toward below normal temperatures, with our highest confidence sitting over the Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast. That could realistically translate into first freezes arriving 1 to 2 weeks earlier than typical, particularly if that colder pattern holds consistent and lines up with when your area usually sees its freeze. Even a warmer September followed by a colder October and November still adds up to a cold fall overall. So timing really does matter here just as much as the average temperature departure itself. My overall read is a better chance of an earlier freeze across the east, paired with a later than normal freeze across the Northwest this fall. Shifting toward the Deep South and leaning more into our winter temperature outlook, since some of these areas don't typically see their freeze until December or even January, especially the farthest southern locations. I think there's a real chance of an earlier freeze in some of these spots too, maybe landing in the first half of December instead of the back half like usual. There's also a reasonable chance that some of the areas that don't average a freeze every year at all, places like Florida and southern Texas, could see that freeze line dip a little farther south than usual this year. That's a fairly common outcome during El Niño winters, since cooler conditions tend to push into the south more readily than they otherwise would. I wouldn't be shocked to see some genuinely surprising freezes show up in areas that don't typically get them, and given how impactful an unexpected freeze can be for agriculture and infrastructure in those regions, from citrus groves to pipes that were never built to handle sustained cold, that's something well worth keeping an eye on as we move deeper into the season.